Hi, I just wanted to discuss acknowledging multiple perspectives when you write and why that's an important thing to do in your college assignments. A lot of the work that you'll do in college will be writing various forms of arguments. And when it comes to argument, what I see a lot is people tending to focus almost exclusively on their own position, on their own opinion, and they tend to ignore these opposing views because they think that it will somehow weaken their perspective if they admit that there are other people who disagree with them. I think it's actually the opposite. When you don't mention that there are views that may contradict or oppose your own, you kind of leave yourself open to attack. And if you don't mention those things, somebody could read your paper and say, well, you didn't mention this, you didn't mention this other perspective, and that's actually going to make somebody trust your writing less. The other added benefit of bringing up these multiple perspectives is that ultimately it's going to help to make your paper longer. When people just cut to the chase and only focus on talking about their own position, a lot of times they will run out of gas by a few pages and they can't figure out why they have a hard time writing more. When you bring up those other perspectives and explain them and offer your rebuttal to those things, that adds length to the paper. So it really benefits you to do that. Another important thing to think about is you don't want to assume that your audience understands much or anything about the topic or situation that you're going to be talking about in a paper. So again, when you don't mention sort of the conversation surrounding some issue, it's going to be hard for the audience to understand why your view matters, right? And what ends up happening is that when you discuss multiple perspectives, it has the effect of kind of making a space for your own view, because what you want to do is make some sort of original point. You don't want to just rehash what other people have said. You want to take those perspectives and then find sort of some space that people haven't discussed as much yet. So I wanted to show you just a simple example of how this might look if you are writing some sort of argumentative paper. So let's say I had a specific essay prompt where my instructor asked me a question. And again, you'll sometimes see these types of assignments in college. But let's say an instructor gives me this prompt. Does technology make us feel more alone? The expectation is you're going to answer that question and make an argument, arguing, mostly this is true or it's not, right? So the way that I would start, even if you feel like you know what you're going to argue for this assignment, I would actually kind of generate some ideas, either typing them out or jotting them down on a piece of paper, where you kind of look at each of these different perspectives on the issue in order to figure out your own. Because when you jot this stuff down, it gives you something to write about when you actually get to the drafting of a paper, right? So let's kind of look at these common perspectives on this question, right? So people who would say, no, technology doesn't make us feel more alone. And again, I just came up with a few common arguments about this. People might say, no, that technology isn't that problematic because it makes it easier for us to connect to people. Another point is that there are so many forms of social media that, a person ultimately doesn't ever have to feel alone because they can always use some social media platform. Another common argument is that people who are shy or socially awkward actually have an easier time connecting through technology than they do in everyday interactions. So it gives them a little bit more security and you might say self-esteem if they can use technology and make friends in that way, right? So then I would want to think about the opposing view, which would be this answer of yes to the question. So some people might argue, well, while we can connect easier, that's probably true, a lot of times those connections don't feel as deep or authentic, especially if you are interacting with strangers whom you've never had any real life interaction with. Another common argument is that social media actually becomes a way to bully people and ostracize them rather than making them feel included. So again, this idea that you can find your own community through technology, well, it's just as easy to kind of push people out and make them feel alienated by using social media. And then my third point here, when people only interact through technology, this actually makes it harder for them when they do have to have real life interactions. So in other words, while people may feel less anxious and find technology to kind of be a security blanket, the other side of that is that realistically, when you get a job, all sorts of other situations, you're going to have to interact with people in real life. And if you become so dependent on technology for your interactions, then it may make real life connections really hard to make, right? So those are the common views maybe on this topic. What I would want to do if I were writing a paper on this is to try to find some angle that doesn't fall into those really obvious perspectives. I can and should talk about those things, but I want to try to situate my own view amongst kind of those obvious things. So I tried to come up with a more complex view that's sort of in the middle of these two ideas. So something I could argue is it may be true that technology does make us feel more alone at times, but that's not necessarily a bad thing to feel alone sometimes. All of those options that I listed above assume that feeling alone is always negative or bad, but I don't think that that's always the case. Another point that I made here is that people need solitude in order to understand themselves, and technology allows them to express themselves in new ways. So reflection might be something that's easier to do through technology, and it may ultimately help form a person's identity better. And then I said kind of, some version of that below. I said we should think of technology as a set of tools to help us develop our identities in relation to the rest of the world in order to figure out who we want and don't want to be, right? So again, it's hard to figure out who you are if you are constantly just following what others do. When you do have a little alone time, I think those are the moments when maybe you really do consider who you are and what you want out of life. So again, if I were going to respond to this initial question that I have at the top, does technology make us feel more alone? I would want to mention really all of these views, but make it clear what my own view is. So if I scroll down, I typed up just a sample paragraph to show you how you might actually incorporate these multiple perspectives into your paper. Sometimes people have a hard time thinking about how to do that. How do I bring up views that are not my own and make it clear what my actual view is without confusing your audience? So I think that's a valid point. But again, if you're careful with how you phrase things, it's going to be obvious to the audience what the difference is between your own perspective and those that you're just bringing up to explain. So when you're bringing up multiple perspectives, and I mean, we'll talk about this later on, especially in your last essay when you are writing an argument, but I think you can start to do this in an introduction for a more argumentative essay, it might be a good idea to, in the very beginning, bring up sort of some of the conversation surrounding the issue that you're going to be talking about. Like, here's what some people say, here's what other people say about it. But what actually might work better if you want to talk about this in more depth is to bring up multiple perspectives, either in a separate background paragraph after your intro, but also maybe when you can think of objections that people might have when you're actually talking about your own argument. What I did here is an example of maybe more of a background paragraph where I'm first mentioning what other people have said about this issue, but then finish with what my own view is, so that the audience can see most of the paper is going to be talking about this last view that I'm discussing. So let me just read kind of a version of what I talked about previously. Here's how this paragraph might work. There tend to be polarized views about the role of technology in our lives in terms of how helpful or harmful it is. But perhaps these positions oversimplify the complex nature of technology and what it does for us. So in that first sentence, I'm just trying to show a true point of this paragraph, which is that it's not as simple as no, technology is good, or yes, technology is bad, right? It's more something in the middle of that. So then I just bring up some of these alternate perspectives, but I always try to use some sort of signal to show that this is not what I think, right? So I said, some argue that people make connections easier than ever before due to tools like social media. And then I said they, in other words, not me. They insist that we now have many convenient ways to interact with people we know well or those who live halfway around the world, which becomes invaluable for those who are shy or suffer from social anxiety. Again, I'm not saying that I believe that. I'm just explaining the position that some people have. Now I'm going to bring up sort of the opposing view of that. Others condemn technology for making people feel alienated and isolated, as digital connections lack the depth of real-life relationships. And again, here's another sort of voice marker where I say those with these concerns, in other words, not me, but those who have those concerns, suggest that technology is more often used to attack or bully others rather than creating community, and makes it harder to have successful in-person interactions. So again, I've brought up these two different views on this same question. And by doing that, I'm sort of making a space for my own perspective, right? I'm saying some people say this, other people say this. Now I'm going to tell you where I lie between these two big perspectives, right? So I start out here by saying, while there's some validity to both of these positions, so I'm acknowledging that I agree to a certain extent with both of those views. That use of the word while shows that I'm going to disagree with it, right? While there is some validity to those positions, the reality of technology's impact seems more complicated than these two ends of the spectrum suggest. It's true that technology can make us feel more alone at times. So again, here I'm saying people who believe that technology makes us feel alone, they're right to a certain extent. But again, I'm responding with this but, right? But unlike technology alarmists believe, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just as social media and other sites can allow for more frequent, though not necessarily deep, connections with others, perhaps technology's most valuable role is in giving us the space to connect to ourselves and express our feelings through these tools. So again, I am using these other perspectives to discuss my own, right? I have to lay out that background so it gives me something to respond to, right? So this is one of the easiest ways to figure out how to add content to your paper. Instead of trying to invent something completely new, use these alternate perspectives as a platform to give you something to talk about. Okay, thanks. Bye.